Thank you very much, Shinge Roshi, Jikyo, Juyo, and everybody in the Zen Study Society, Shoboji, and Daibosatsu community for inviting me here to speak about D.T. Suzuki at the 40th anniversary of the founding of Daibosatsu and the 50th anniversary of D.T. Suzuki's death, which was on July 12, 1966. It's also the 60th anniversary, and I guess that's why that's on the bag, of this founding of the Zen Study Society in April of 1956. It is a real pleasure to be here for a couple of reasons. It's a beautiful place. It reminds me quite a bit of Tassajara, where I practiced for 3 years back when I was a Zen student at the San Francisco Zen Center for about a decade, back in the 70s on into the 80s before I went to graduate school. But when I left the Zen Center to go to graduate school, one of the things I had in mind when I went off to do this, I thought, well, I love Buddhism. How can I make a living doing Buddhism in the United States? I know I'll become a professor of Buddhist studies. And, I actually have made a living talking about Buddhism, which is quite amazing to be able to do that in this country. But anyway, one of the things I had in mind was to take a look in a deep way at the history and teachings of Buddhism, and then bring that back in some form when I could to people who were practicing. And so when I get an opportunity like this to speak to a group that is so devoted to preserving and practicing the Buddhist teaching, it really is a pleasure for me. So thank you. Before talking about Suzuki's approach to Zen, I would like to talk for a few minutes about his role in the history of this organization, which I know some of the senior students here are well aware of. But he had a major role in the Zen Study Society that gave birth to this monastery some 40 years ago. Many of you are aware, no doubt, of the deep karmic ties he had with the Zen Study Society. In the spring of 1956, Cornelius Crane, Bernard Phillips, Richard DiMartino, and George Yamaoka founded the society. The Zen Study Society eventually, with fits and starts, grew into this community that built Shoboji in New York City, and in 1976, this monastery. Cornelius Crane, who died in 1962, took the lead in founding the Zen Study Society. Cornelius was the scion of the magnificently wealthy Chicago-based Crane family that built a manufacturing empire that included, until 1990, a division that produced plumbing fixtures, commodes, urinals, and sinks that appoint many public restrooms even today. I think men may be more aware of it than women, but just by the nature of things. But a lot of public restrooms, there's Crane plumbing fixtures, and it no longer is part of the Crane Manufacturing Company. It's owned by a Canadian company now, but that was one of the sources of their income. It was a vast manufacturing empire. They made elevators, ship propellers, all kinds of things. Appropriately given the middle name Vanderbilt, Cornelius inherited an enormous fortune from his father, Richard Crane II, that included the Castle Hill estate in Ipswich, Massachusetts. This sprawling mansion and stretch of beach now comprise Crane's Beach, which has become a state park. His widow, his second wife, Mineko Sawahara Crane, gave it to the state of Massachusetts. I don't know how many of you remember the film Witches of Eastwick. Do any of you remember that movie? The mansion, a 59-room mansion, where much of the story takes place, was Cornelius Crane Castle Hill summer home. That was one of his summer homes. The Crane family had ties with Suzuki dating back to the 1930s, as Charles Richard Crane, Cornelius' uncle, had met Suzuki on a trip to Japan and had sponsored Suzuki's trip to Europe and across the United States in 1936. During that pre-World War II visit, Suzuki had been hosted at Charles Crane's New York apartment, and Jikyo showed me a scroll that actually has the address of that apartment, which must be a draft of a letter that Suzuki wrote in the 1930s when he was in the States. And then late in 1936, he went to Crane's sprawling date farm in Coachella Valley, California, which now is more famous for music concerts, I believe, than his estate, where Suzuki instructed him, Charles Richard Crane, in Zazen. Charles continued to subsidize some of Suzuki's publications and remained in touch with him until he died in 1939. Charles Crane died in 1939, that is. I don't know if Charles Crane ever mentioned Suzuki to his nephew Cornelius, but I would not be surprised if Cornelius had at least heard a story or two about the Japanese scholar prior to meeting him. Or perhaps he had noticed that Suzuki's book, which became one of his best-selling books, its original title was Zen and Its Influence on Japanese Culture. It became Zen and Japanese Culture after the war, is dedicated to Charles Richard Crane. It was during Suzuki's East Coast lecture tour during the winter of 1950 to 51 that he re-entered the orbit of the Crane family. In 1940, Cornelius had married a woman named Catherine Parker and adopted her daughter from her first marriage, Kathleen, who would become the mother of the comedian Chevy Chase, just to help you place this thing in the pop cultural landscape. So Cornelius was the step-grandfather of Chevy Chase of the Vacation movie and Saturday Night Live fame. All right. We're getting down to the serious stuff here. Catherine Crane Parker first heard Suzuki when he was giving a series of talks on Buddhism sponsored by the Church Peace Union, which was funded by the Carnegie Endowment and now is known as the Carnegie Peace Fellowship or Carnegie Council, I believe, in New York City in the winter of 1950 to 51. Kathy, along with Cornelius, was a patient of the famous psychoanalyst Karen Horney, who had long been intrigued by Suzuki's writing on Zen, particularly Zen Buddhism and its influence on Japanese culture, which happened to be dedicated to her patient Cornelius's uncle. So that may have come up in the course of their therapy. I don't know how many of you have heard of Horney, but she was a very well-known, very early feminist neo-Freudian psychoanalyst and one-time lover. Again, I'm full of anecdotes here, but that's what I do, of Erich Fromm, who also became very interested in Zen, of course. In the early 50s, Horney had begun exploring possible connections between Zen and psychoanalysis. And it was Horney's patient, Catherine, Cornelius's ex-wife at the time, but they were still friends, who reputedly was the source for the wonderful quotation in Horney's book, Neurosis and Human Growth, which reads, "If it were not for reality," if it were not for reality, see, I'm having trouble with reality myself. If it were not for reality, I would be perfectly all right. Don't forget that. That's a good one, isn't it? When Catherine mentioned Suzuki to Horney, the therapist asked her to arrange a dinner with him. And Catherine got on the phone and invited Suzuki to a dinner party that included Horney, Richard DiMartino, who was Suzuki's assistant at the time. He'd been a GI, he'd met Suzuki in Japan, and gotten very interested in Zen. And Kathy's now former husband, but still friend, Cornelius Crane. The diners had numerous interests in common, and inspired by Suzuki, quickly hatched a plan to visit Japan. In July 1952, about a year later, the trip occurred with Horney, her daughter Bridget, Catherine, Cornelius, Suzuki, D.T. Suzuki, and DiMartino traveled together in Japan, where they toured the country and spent time at Shogenji in Gifu Prefecture. And Horney dabbled a bit, tried out doing Zazen and so on there. By September, back in the United States, they reconvened up in Massachusetts at Castle Hill, where they continued to discuss Zen, psychiatry, and the Japan adventure. Horney tragically died of cancer just a few months later, cutting short the growing collaboration with Suzuki. But by that time, Cornelius had taken a deep interest in Zen and in Suzuki's work. And from what I can tell from the documents that you all have been kind enough to share with me that are in the Zen Study Society archive here, Cornelius was prone to adulating and supporting those who inspired him. He had already attempted, with little success, to fund his therapist Hornai in various ways, funding advertising for her books and so on, much of which she refused, prior to turning his attentions to Suzuki. Suzuki, while in New York in 1950 to 51, had been based at the Union Theological Seminary and then at Columbia University, where he gave a series of lectures on Buddhism, followed by a course on Chinese Buddhism and Kegon Huayan Avatamsaka, the jewel net of Indra, in the spring term of 1952. As he neared the end of the Rockefeller grant that had funded his course at Columbia, Cornelius arranged to continue paying his salary for 1953-1954 academic year. And although I don't have any proof of this at this point, I've seen about 1953-54, Cornelius probably continued to fund Suzuki's salary for the next 2 years or so, through the spring of 1957, when he formally stepped down from his position at Columbia. That's the kind of, the Crane family, I was telling somebody in a conversation, they had the kind of wealth that was basically limitless wealth. That they would, at the drop of a hat, they would pay someone's salary for a year so they could go on a tour with them to Japan. So basically, if someone like me, a professor, they'd say, well, you want to go to Japan? Well, I'm working. That's okay. I'll pay your salary. You come with me and show me the sights and talk about Buddhism. They did this, and this is what Cornelius could easily do. It was at this juncture that Cornelius, who'd become passionate about Zen, decided to form the Zen Study Society, enlisting as founding members, along with himself, Suzuki's disciple and acolyte, Richard DiMartino, Bernard Phillips, then a professor of philosophy at the University of Delaware, George Yamaoka, a New York lawyer who had served as the defense attorney at the Tokyo war crimes trials. He was a GI, ex-GI, Japanese-American, and he had defended the people who had been accused of war crimes in Japan. And some of them, he was on the team anyway. And lastly, Suzuki. The founding document for the society stated that the group was formed, and this is the group that gave rise to this place, in order to undertake, I'm quoting now, quote, to undertake the study of Zen Buddhism in its religious, philosophic, and psychological aspects, its influence on Oriental cultures, and its relation to world religions and philosophies, and its reference for the life of modern man. Today you would you would gender it quite that way and say for modern people or whatever, but modern man, end quote. So that's quite a tall order, and I hope you're holding up your end of the bargain here. That was a tall order, to be sure. And one of the striking features of the statement is its overwhelmingly intellectual orientation, which, although suitable for Suzuki's purposes, and I think it's characteristic of Suzuki in general, he had a very intellectual approach to Zen, and Engakuji, where he trained with Shaku Soen, was reputed in Zen circles to be one of the more intellectual, sometimes they condemned for it, intellectual of the streams of Rinzai Zen. Although this was suitable for Suzuki's purpose, it fell short of beginning the institutional groundwork necessary, this is my own opinion, to establish actual Zen practice in the United States. According to the founding agreement of the society, which was signed by Cornelius and Suzuki on April 30th, 1957, Suzuki would serve as, and I'm quoting again, quote, visiting professor, lecturer, and translator to lecture and translate Zen texts and do research in Zen Buddhism and related subjects, close quote. In return, the society committed itself to providing Suzuki with $8,000 a year for an initial period of 5 years. Now that doesn't sound like a lot of money to us today, but just to help you sort of map this, my advisor at Yale, when he started there in 1968, received $12,000 a year as his starting salary. That was a decade later. And according to the Measuring Worth website calculator, which I used, Today it would amount to close to, and this is a little squirrely, this figure, but close to $70,000. And this is for Suzuki just to do his thing, basically. And Cornelius was the main funder of the Zen Study Society. And you have in your archive the canceled checks and the check stubs and so on that document these payments that were made to the society. Cornelius then was funding Suzuki just as his position at Columbia was ending, and Suzuki then became the visiting professor, quote unquote, for the Zen Study Society. Now Cornelius he was extremely generous, and he had close to limitless wealth to lavish upon those he admired. He was also impulsive, hot-headed, and demanding. He was used to telling people what to do and having them do it, as best as I can tell from reading the documents in the files that are in the Zen Study Society and other letters that I've read in the Suzuki archive and elsewhere. After a few years of involvement with the Zen Study Society, even less than that, Cornelius grew frustrated with the slow pace in the production of books by Suzuki and other publications on Zen that DeMartino and others had promised to produce. Here we must remember Suzuki was 87 years old at the time and pulled in multiple directions by meetings, lectures, and so on. So I'm not surprised at his slow rate of production. DeMartino, who also had promised to help pull together some of Hisamatsu's lectures up at Cambridge, was also delinquent. In frustration, Cornelius sent letters to all the members of the society, resigning from the organization in April 1958. Despite quitting the society, Cornelius promised Suzuki, for whom he clearly cared deeply, to continue funding Suzuki with an annuity so that the Zen scholar would not have to worry about money. Cornelius did not specify about how long he would continue to pay Suzuki the $8,000 a year, but he did so at least until July 1962, and there's an uncashed check, maybe you should cash it, in the archive made out to Suzuki that was written just days before Cornelius died. I believe it was of a heart attack or something like that, in July of 1962. He did not leave any stipulation in his will, however, and after his death, his widow, Mineko, and the family decided not to continue supporting the society or to continue supporting Suzuki, and so the funding ended. There were other wealthy Americans, however, who continued to send money to help support Suzuki, a number of acolytes and people interested in Zen. I'm not going to go any further in the history of the society past that time, but I want to mention that before turning back to Suzuki, who I'm supposed to be speaking about, that the society largely was dormant from the time of Cornelius' death until May 1965. In a decision resisted in part by Suzuki, the remaining members elected Edo Taishimano, Hakun Yasutani, Soen Nakagawa, and several other people to membership in the society. On August 4th, 1965, George Yamaoka, the lawyer who'd been the secretary for the society since its inception, also resigned. Suzuki, now 95 years old, had little to do with the society after that point as well. So having now sketched this connection between this institution and Suzuki, I want to talk for the remainder of time about Suzuki's approach to Zen and why I think it's worthwhile for people who are practicing Zen to take a look again at his writings. And in this process, I also want to correct a few fundamental misconceptions about him. For those of you who have misconceptions about him, some of you may not have, the newer practitioners, Suzuki may not mean that much to you other than his pictures on the altar here. But for people of my generation, when we started practicing, and my seniors at the San Francisco Zen Center and elsewhere, at one point that was just about all there was to read about Zen was D.T. Suzuki. And a lot of people, the first book they read on Zen was something by D.T. Suzuki. So as many of you know, Suzuki lived for close to a century. He's born on the Japan Sea coast in Kanazawa in 1870, and he died in a Tokyo hospital on July 12, 1966, which is why we're honoring the 50th anniversary of his death as part of today's celebration. He began his practice in 1891 with Imakita Kosen at the monastery Engakuji in Kitakamakura. He then worked with Imakita's Dharma successor, Shakusoen, until Soen's death in 1919. Besides spending much of the 50s in New York City, the 1950s, Suzuki had been in the United States from 1897 to 1908, living in LaSalle, Illinois, a small town west of Chicago. Probably the only Japanese within shouting distance and then some in LaSalle, Illinois. One of the primary misunderstandings about Suzuki that's common not only among scholars, but also I think among practitioners, and I know Aitken Roshi in an interview that I saw has sort of stated something along these lines, believe that although Suzuki was well-read, he actually had a rather superficial understanding of Zen, having only practiced at Engakuji for a few years before departing for the United States in 1897. It was not long before leaving Japan that Suzuki, according to his own later account, passed his first koan and a series of checking questions. As far as many who write about Suzuki are concerned, that was the extent of his practice. In fact, however, Suzuki's Zen practice was intensive and long-lasting. Contrary to much that's been written, his experience of Kensho and his departure for the United States did not mark the end of his formal Zen training. He remained in close contact with his teacher Shakusoen while he was in the United States. And when Soen came over, he accompanied him for about a year around the United States as an interpreter and helping him find his way across the United States. When Suzuki went back to Japan in 1909, and he was working in Tokyo until 1921, he took advantage of the train from Tokyo to Kamakura and spent a considerable amount of time practicing with his teacher. And I'm going to sort of jump ahead a little bit here so I don't run too long. But basically, he spent almost all of his free time when he wasn't teaching in Tokyo going down to see his teacher and working with Soen. They were extremely close. And so he worked with Soen up until Soen's death in 1919, editing a journal with him and continuing Sanzen. And you can see in his diaries from time to time he writes down, went to Kamakura, had Sanzen with Shakusoen. Now, he says very little about his koan practice in his own accounts. But a very close confidant of his, who was a Rinzai priest and someone who had received Inka Shomei, Akizuki Ryomin, who said about Suzuki, it had come up in a conversation, that Suzuki at one point mentioned that toward the end of his time with Shakusoen, he had been working on what are called the Kojo koan, which come at the end, at least in this particular stream of Rinzai Zen, of the system of koan training. And Akizuki speculates that had Soen lived, in all likelihood Suzuki would have finished the whole system of koan training and might even have received permission to teach as a lay teacher. But Soen died in 1919, and Suzuki then never worked with another teacher after that. He just set out on his own, and that was the end of his formal Zen study. Although Suzuki, as we can see, had been deeply immersed in the turn-of-the-century Rinzai practice, his role and was a spokesperson for Zen, Buddhism, and Japanese culture, his position escapes easy characterization. He held no rank other than that of an ordained layman, and for many years he worked as a university professor teaching English at the Piers School, Gakushuin, and at Otani University. But he did not hold a formal degree. He didn't even graduate high school. He didn't hold a formal degree until he was awarded a PhD in 1934 by Otani University. While making major contributions to the scholarly literature, His understanding and presentation of the Buddhist tradition cleaved in many ways to traditional Rinzai understandings of Zen. At the same time, over the course of his career, he brought his understanding of Zen tradition into dialogue with numerous currents of modern thought, including existentialism, idealism, pragmatism, psychoanalysis, Swedenborgianism, psychology, theosophy, transcendentalism, and many others. I mean, one of the remarkable things about him was his ability to recast Zen in a way that spoke to the sort of avant-garde intellectuals of the day. And he changed the language he used to talk about Zen. It was very much a modern presentation of Zen, and it was modern Zen. But as I was speaking with Shinge Roshi and I were talking this morning, or was it at dinner? I can't remember which, this morning maybe. It was it's modern Zen, and some people have sort of poo-pooed this as a kind of, well, it's not authentic Zen, but leave it up to you to figure out what that might be. Nonetheless, despite writing on an incredibly wide range of topics concerning Buddhism and Japanese culture, from the time Suzuki went off to Engakuji as a young man, he was, I would say, a Rinzai guy through and through. He wrote a lot about Pure Land, and there's a wonderful volume in the bookstore, his writings on Pure Land Buddhism. Pick up a copy if you're interested. It's very good stuff. But his perspective on even Pure Land was very much a Rinzai perspective. He had his perspective on Shinran was largely an immanentalist one. That is to say, the Pure Land, if we are awakened, is right here, right now. Or, again, to get back to that Zazen Wasan that someone just mentioned, the Song of Zazen by Hakuin, the place where we stand is the pure lotus land, and this body is the body of Buddha. Suzuki remained committed at times in an almost doctrinaire fashion to Rinzai Zen, as he had practiced it with Soen and Imakita, and as it was practiced in the Rinzai training temples in Kamakura and Kyoto, convinced that it was the best way to achieve an understanding of Zen, which in a word Suzuki equated with myo, the wondrous. He said, and I have an epigraph to the introduction to the Zen volume of his selected writings that I edited. Suzuki, a wonderful saying that he wrote as a young man in the United States after he'd come over here. It was in the, probably would have been around 1898, 1899. He said, in a word, Zen is about the wondrous, myo. To talk about or look for Zen apart from the wondrous, and here he uses a Japanese sort of expression, is as stupid as looking for fish in the trees. When non-Japanese interested in practicing Zen came to Suzuki asking for help, he inevitably introduced them to Rinzai teachers. And again, I'm going to abbreviate a little bit here, but a whole slew of people from the 1930s on, ranging from Ruth Fuller Sasaki, Ruth Fuller Everett at the time. He introduced her to her teachers, Rinzai teachers, and on through the 50s, people like Philip Kaplow, Robert Aitken, Donald Ritchie, Cornelius Crane, Bernard Phillips. He steered them all towards orthodox, as he considered them, orthodox Rinzai teachers. Although he believed that transformative religious experiences occurred in all religious traditions, which is why he could have these dialogues, very deep dialogues with people like Thomas Merton. So in most of them, he felt awakening or an understanding of myo, or what he sometimes called the continuum, to get Star Trek-y here, was a matter of happenstance. The system of koan training that had developed and was preserved by Rinzai Zen, according to Suzuki, however, was not subject to these vicissitudes. Rather than occurring spontaneously and haphazardly, Suzuki wrote, for those who practice Rinzai Zen with a competent master, and again, while you're figuring out what authentic Zen is, you tell me who a competent master is as well. The Zen experience is possible, and a state of Satori will surely come. He said, give or take 10 years. Suzuki, while acknowledging the flaws in the koan system developed by Hakuin and his disciples, also believed it was essential for ensuring that Zen did not degenerate into mere passivity. And here I'm quoting, "The systematization of the koan is therefore the one thing that is most characteristic of Zen. It is this that saves Zen from sinking into trance, from becoming absorbed in mere contemplation, from turning into an exercise in tranquilization," close quote. At the heart of practice, according to Suzuki, was a combination of zazen and koan, both of which were required for successful realization. He saw zazen as indispensable for reaching a thorough understanding of Zen, for, again quoting, "Even when the koan is understood, its deep spiritual truth will not be driven home to the mind of the student if he is not thoroughly trained in zazen. Koan and zazen are the two handmaids of Zen. The first is the eye and the second is the foot," close quote. Nonetheless, although the practice of seated meditation is necessary for the student to realize fully the meaning of the koan, at the same time zazen practice alone was nothing more than, quote-unquote, a secondary consideration. Because Zen did not consider meditative concentration, jhana, Zen, an end in itself. Overemphasis on the practice of zazen, according to Suzuki, created a stumbling block to true realization, which is why, if you read his writings, you don't see all that much about zazen in there. He really downplayed it to a point that, again, now I'm editorializing here, may not have been exactly what American Buddhists in that need to hear. Although in the United States and Europe, Suzuki is frequently associated with Zen-inspired writings and cultural products created willy-nilly by people like John Cage, Leonora Carrington, Kerouac, you know the drill, Alan Watts, Allen Ginsberg, Timothy Leary, and others. He actually was pretty critical of what they said about Zen. He wrote, "To understand Zen," again, quote, "to understand Zen, Satori is needed. Without this experience, no amount of talk is of any use in elucidating what Zen is. What such writers with no Satori may write cannot be of first-hand significance." He emphasized that what was required was a number of years of practice, Satori, and a mastery of the whole range of Zen literature. And here Suzuki really emphasized not just practice, but a deep, thorough grounding in the literature of Zen for a full understanding of the tradition. About the beats, Suzuki harshly observed, quote, "Lately there have taken place some incidents around me. One of them is the rise of the so-called beat generation, which at present is calling public attention to itself not only in America but also in Japan. They grossly misrepresent Zen, and there are some people who imagine that Zen is really responsible for this movement." Close quote. I'm getting towards the end here. So. This is not to say that Suzuki was totally uncritical of the Rinzai tradition either, as it existed in 20th century Japan. In fact, Suzuki was a layman, found much that needed improvement in the way Zen was presented to those inside and outside the monastery walls. Although Suzuki contended that the koan system in Rinzai Zen was the best means for ensuring awakening, he was aware of the artificiality of the system and widespread abuses in koan study. According to Suzuki, the system of koan gave the trainee access to satori and a true understanding of Zen, but the koan system was, unlike the most well-known koan, which were quote-unquote alive to the very core, subject to abuse by those for whom Zen consisted merely of, quote, climbing up the gradation of the koans one after another, close quote. Those who took such a formulaic approach, however, were missing the main point of Zen, which Suzuki wrote was, quote, the unfolding of man's inner life, close quote. Without faith and personal effort, Zen became nothing more than a mere bubble. If the practitioner had the proper spirit of inquiry, truly grasping the meaning of a handful of koans, or even just one of them, could reveal the depths of Zen. Although the koan system is practiced in Rinzai Zen, was, quote, the only method nowadays to master Zen anywhere, at the same time it's liable to induce students to cherish a limited and imperfect interpretation of Zen. The spirit of Zen is destroyed and crippled thereby. Japan is at present suffering from this type of Zen. The so-called Roshis and their disciples are unable to transcend the koan, close quote. In another essay, Dogen Hakuin Bankei, written in the 40s and included in the Zen volume I edited, Suzuki wrote explicitly of problems he saw with the systematization of the system. Quote, this is the real reason why masters of the past devised the method of giving koan to their students. It was, as I've been saying, an expression of the deepest compassion, what Zen calls grandmotherly kindness. But along with that kindness goes an accordingly great danger. The danger lies in the tendency to formalization. It may happen that a petty thief, crowing like the cock at dawn, will get past the barrier by deceiving the gatekeeper into opening the gates. As a matter of fact, in the koan system, such fellows do get past, or rather we should say, and this is important, that they are passed through. The danger that the goods will be sold cheap is something intrinsic to the system. In any construct devised by man, a pattern invariably evolves. When the pattern becomes fixed, the quick of life cannot move within it. When the realm of true reality, which is free of samsaric suffering, is treated in such a way that it comes to resemble the fixed gestures and pattern moves learned in a fencing class, Zen ceases to be Zen. At times, patterns work well and are useful, and they do have the virtue of universal currency, but no living thing is produced from that alone. I suppose, though, that there are some who even find enjoyment in such counterfeit, lifeless things, much as they would divert themselves with a game of chess or mahjong. People who tell me he doesn't know anything about Zen, I read that and I think, you don't know anything about Suzuki. Furthermore, in interviews and private correspondence, Suzuki also voiced criticism of the establishment, including many Zen masters of his day, for their insularity and conservatism. In 1927, he wrote, quote, in any case, the thing called Zen should not be cloistered in the monastery. It should be made available to the world, close quote. Writing to Ruth Fuller Sasaki for information about how her teacher approached the Blue Cliff record, he complained about the lack of attention among contemporary masters to Val, Seigan, and liberating others in contemporaneous Zen approaches to the text, concluding that, quote, most of the so-called Roshis in Japan are a self-sufficient or self-complacent sort of teachers. They are not modern men, close quote. What was necessary, Suzuki continued, was a concrete rather than merely intellectual interpretation of the doctrine of reaching out to sentient beings in order to liberate them. Geke Shujo, to reach down and liberate sentient beings. I'm right near the end here, so bear with me. In a brief preface to a book concerning koan by Akizuki that was written just more than a year before his death, Suzuki summed up the views concerning the strengths and weaknesses of Rinzai practice in Japan. Writing about the use of koan to move one from the world of working, this world, to the world of seeing, the world of insight, awakening, satori. In just a few sentences, Suzuki alluded to Nishida Kitaro's philosophy and Dongshan Liangjia's 5 ranks. In calling on those in cloistered monasteries to make their teachings accessible to all, Suzuki expressed his hopes for Zen in the modern world. And I will now quote at the end of my talk here. This is Suzuki. Thinking about it, there is nothing so mysterious as human existence. After falling into a snare of our own making, we then writhe in agony, and we contrive to get free. it really makes one wonder what life is for. From moving, working, or in other words, seeing. From moving, or in other words, working, it is good to go on and participate in the world of seeing, or the world of insight. But the one who sees comes to see himself as an independent existence, completely isolated from the one at work. A person who has moved from working to seeing must now once again to return to the midst of work. Is that not the meaning of, quote, finally returning to sit at ease among the dust and ashes? That's the last of the 5 ranks. That's returning in the 10 Oxfording pictures, returning with bliss-bestowing hands. I love this phrase. I believe in modernizing this sentiment so that Zen can serve as a vital force today. Never one to pay much attention to the tedious task of institution building or running an organization, I imagine that Suzuki would be surprised, bemused, and largely pleased to see the extent to which Buddhism has entered the fabric of life in the United States at the beginning of the 21st century, even while remaining critical about some of the twists and turns it has taken along the way. As one of American Buddhism's inspirations and guiding lights, Suzuki helped spawn the temples, monasteries, and practice centers that now dot our landscape. It is fitting, therefore, that we honor his memory today as we celebrate the founding of Daibo Satsu. Thank you.
Just a second. Hold on just a second.
ただいまは素晴らしい偉大なるこの鈴木大拙博士のお話を聞かせてもらって Thank you very much.
I was very deeply pleased to hear about the Suzuki Daisetsu Sensei's talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 私も鈴木大拙博士は2、3回お会いしてます。
I have also met Suzuki Daisetsu Sensei a few times.
それは京都に、来られて、山田門老師を訪ねて来られたことが2、3回あるんです。
He has come to visit Yamada Mumon Roshi a few times.
で、その時はもちろん私はヤングマンですよ。
At that time I was a young man.
花園ユニバーシティ、京都、イン京都、花園大学で、そこに、講演に来られました。
He has come visit to give a talk at the University of Hanazono in Myoshinji.
その時に、世界的な禅の哲学者ということを、私たち聞かされたわけでありますが。
And at that time, he was introduced as worldwide famous philosopher.
その禅的な思想というものをその時初めて、聞くことができました。
And it was my first time to hear the philosophy of Zen.
しかし、禅は究極のところは後をとどめないということですから。
どう言ったらいいでしょうかね。the Zen 後をとどめない。
後を残さない。鳥飛ぶが、鳥の後ないようにね。
So the Zen is about leave no trace.
ですから、私はその時聞いたことは全て忘れました。
So what I heard at that day of Daisetsu Suzuki, I completely forgot.
もう60年前ですからね、今思えばね、何かやっぱり記憶に残しておくべきだったと思います。でも、
It was 60 years ago, so But I feel that I should have remembered something from that lecture.
しかし、杉博士にお会いしたその面影というものは、未だにちゃんとここに残っています。
However, the moment I saw him, I met him, that remembrance is here with me.
大変、日本的に言えば、高校や、訳できるかな、高校や、素晴らしい、いいおじい様という感じ。素晴らしい、良いおじい様だという感じ。
So my impression was he was wonderful elderly man.
哲学者だという、そういう面影は全くなかった。
There was no sense of being a philosopher.
それがまた素晴らしい。
And I thought that was a wonderful thing.
それは全的な、やっぱり、ものを研究、あるいは自分で体験しておられるから、そういう姿が出て、常に表しておられたと私は思っています。
And it is my impression that because he has deeply studied Zen, it was the manifestation of his insight.
それから、もう一つ、つい最近、もう1ヶ月も経たない、20日ぐらい前に、金沢、日本の金沢、ご存知ですか、故郷になるね、最初探すの。金沢に、杉大雪記念館という素晴らしい建物ができました。
And just about recently, 20 days ago, in Kanazawa, close to Nagano, there is a museum of Suzuki Taisetsu.
これはね、私も今言いましたように、20日ぐらい前に初めて訪ねて行きましたが、本当に、建物も素晴らしいし、その設計もまた素晴らしかったです。
And I visited the museum just about 20 days ago, and the building and the architecture was quite an impressive one.
日本的なこの自然の庭があって、池があって、それを見ながら、こう、シッティング、考える、瞑想にふける、そういう場所もあります。
And there is a place designated for meditation, looking over this beautiful garden.
もしもまた皆さん日本に来られて金沢へ行かれる機会があったら、鈴木大雪記念館をお訪ねください。
So if you ever have a chance to visit Japan, please go to Kanazawa to go to Suzuki Daisetsu's museum.
必ず鈴木大雪さんにお会いできると私は思います。
I believe inevitably you will be able to meet Daisetsu Suzuki there.
Thank you very much.